Good afternoon. We'll start on time and let the others struggle in as they finish up their lunch sessions. I'd like you to join me in this excellent panel today on the topic of investing in the SDGs. And I like the term investing because it has the element of finance within it to achieve those targets, because the latest estimates show that it will take about over $1 trillion a year for Africa to meet the Sustainable Development Goals. And as of today, when you look at the progress, some studies show that Africa is on track in at least 3 of the 17 targets, particularly on gender equality, on climate action, and then on life on land. But for all the others, Africa is at risk and therefore may not likely reach those targets unless we do something different. So to address these issues on the panel, I'd like first to introduce them. We have Dr. Hans-Paul Bürkner, chairman of Boston Consulting Group in Germany. We have Mr. André Hoffmann, who is vice chairman of Roche in Switzerland, but also on the trustee of the World Economic Forum. And then we have Edward Ndopu, who has a very cool title. He's the advocate for the Sustainable Development Goals at the United Nations. And then we have Mark Suzman, who is president for Global Policy and Advocacy, but also chief strategy officer for the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. So with this panel, we're going to address a number of key topics, but I'd like to start first with Hans-Paul. And Hans, when you at the BCG have looked at these broader issues of the Sustainable Development Goals, and particularly how Africa is doing, and I'd like to ask you, first of all, where do you see the track, how Africa is tracking right now, and what measures do you think are appropriate to tell the story of where we are on the SDGs?
Thanks very much. It's really good to be on this panel. Clearly, Africa is making progress, but as we have heard, session after session yesterday and already today, there is not one Africa. There are many Africas, 54 countries, and while some have done well and have done well for a consistent time, others have moved sideways, and some maybe even have moved back. I think obviously there is a great story in Botswana for many, many years. There is a very strong story positive story in Rwanda. Ethiopia has accelerated the process opening up. And we also heard from one of the ministers from Ghana, that for over the last 2 or 3 years, progress has been made. But I think the key is not to look at just at the continent in general, but to really look at country by country and SDG by SDG. And then we find a very, very broad picture. Overall, as I said, a positive movement forward. But also, I think a lot of gaps that are appearing. And one of the clear efforts is really the need to really mobilize all the forces, domestic and foreign, public and private, to make that work. I think one of the key elements is to be open and not to assume it can only be public, it can only be domestic, because we don't want outsiders to interfere. And it really requires enormous efforts. And as we have seen, those countries which have been opening up and have been quite open for a while have really benefited the most. And that would be, I would say, our clear understanding, because many of the ideas, many of the solutions are also coming from the outside. There's nothing wrong with copying. There's nothing wrong with copying mobile payments, which came from Kenya, and for the rest of the world. And so I think countries in Africa and the people in Africa should also be open to learn from the others, from each other, of course, in Africa, but also from outside, and to embrace solutions, try out things, and allow really both the private and the public sector entities to engage, even on issues which of education, health, water, energy, food. I think it is really important not to exclude any potential party to this massive effort.
And could I maybe drill a little bit further on that? And if you look at the factors that were supporting Africa's growth and development, which are globalization, finance, and trade, some of these now are causing risks. So when you look at these broad partnerships that you have mentioned, where do you see the opportunity to use the trends that are globally against Africa right now to address the SDGs? Do you have any wise words for the audience today?
Well, I think if of course you only see Africa as providing commodities, whether it's soft or hard commodities, then I think, okay, Africa has benefited from the enormous growth in Asia, in particular China. But when that growth has slowed and commodity prices have come down, Africa seems to have suffered. I think one of the key elements is not to assume that every country, has to do the same thing and everything by itself. If you want to have, further processing of minerals in Africa, it cannot be done in each country by itself because some of the refineries, the smelters need massive amounts of energy, and you don't have that everywhere. So, working together, having intra-African trade and exchange, and also allocation of industries and so forth really makes a lot of sense rather than saying we need to do everything ourselves. And I think one of the key elements is where I think globalization really has not reached. Africa is maybe more connected to Asia than to other African countries. And I think that's where I think a lot of globalization opening up still has to happen. And I think the free trade agreement is a right step, but it needs implementation, as the Deputy Secretary General of the UN has emphasized.
Wonderful. So we've talked about implementation, so I'm going to turn to André, because a lot of the areas where Africa is behind are on the health, education, and the social sectors in general. You and your company have had a very successful experiment with results here in the health side. So could you tell us from the example that you have been working on, what could the other first describe it to us, but then what could we learn in the other areas of the SDGs?
Well, thank you very much. It's a great honor to be on this panel, and it's a good idea for me to be able to talk, to have the opportunity to talk about what our company has been doing. Our company, Hoffmann La Roche, is one of the largest pharmaceutical companies on the planet, and it has a division doing exclusively diagnostics. So if we want to eradicate HIV/AIDS infection globally, we need to make sure that we work according to a well-orchestrated scorecard. We need to first be able to diagnose people, we need to be able to bring them treatment, and we need to be able to maintain them in a very suppressed environment. So in order to achieve this, the idea of just selling drugs is not going to make it. You need to have a combination, a collaboration between different actors. And in the case of our program in Africa, which we have initiated with the Clinton Foundation 15 years ago, we've been working on a loose coalition of NGOs, of the World Health Organization, of local companies, of health systems, so government in Africa, under our lead. And we have created a new ecosystem which has allowed to identify a new class of patients, people who didn't know before that they were HIV positive. The targets of the World Health Organization have been expressed with three numbers, 90, 90, 90. So the target is to identify 90% of the people who are infected, and for that we make available at an appropriate price, because it's not the same for all of Africa, at an appropriate price, the tests that will discover if you are HIV positive. We worked a lot on the technology of these tests because they are now working in a dry environment, which is normally not possible. We created a plasma count, which allows us to send samples per post without having to send somebody there, which gives a better profile of diagnosis. So that allowed us to define the population. The second is, out of this 90%, we need to diagnose precisely the another 90% of that population. So 90, 90, 90, the last 90 being 90% of this new sample receiving the treatment. And this, if you translate it in WHO's speak, means that about 73% of the population will be virally suppressed, of the HIV will be virally suppressed in time. So for me, this is an absolute excellent example of how you can actually, with a private-public partnership, by involving people in civil society and people in businesses, you can actually bring forward a result which contributes to the SDG. And HIV is a success story. 30, 40 years ago, people just died as soon as they contracted it. Today, we are able to maintain a population outside of the city centers with poor access to health system to be treated. So that would be my example of a successful SDG-related campaign.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So this puts me in a very good position now to challenge Edward, or maybe even get your views on this. Half of the world's poor are in Africa. A third of the people at risk for malnutrition are Africans. We have 11 years to go. You are the advocate for the UN on these matters. So first of all, do you agree with these numbers and the challenge that we're facing? And can you share with us what you think has worked and where we still have a lot of work to do?
So I think that we are addressing the Sustainable Development Goals by sustaining the status quo in many ways. And I think as we approach 2020, when we mark the 10-year countdown and the decade of delivery, I think it's an invitation for us to reimagine the way that we do global public policy. I'm often asked, what SDG do you work on specifically? And I think this is a problematic question because by their very nature, the SDGs are interrelated. It's a universal agenda. It's a blueprint for the vision that we have for humanity. And so we need to approach the SDGs by adopting a multidisciplinary and intersectional approach. So for example, when we speak about climate change, for example, SDG 13 is very much linked to SDG 5 on gender equality, right? Because we know that indigenous people, for example, and indigenous women specifically, bear the brunt of the devastation of the climate crisis in low areas around the world. So I think there is need for us to reevaluate the methodologies that we use. And so within an African context, I think the biggest challenge with regard to assessing where we are in terms of reaching the SDGs is really around data and the absence of data. But also where data is present, it's often not disaggregated in the way that is quite useful for us, right? So I think the challenge really is around our tools, and public policymakers, I think now are required to not just think in terms of innovation, but to really be quite creative, to think in terms of imagination as well, in terms of moving beyond the compartmentalized ways of thinking and looking at the world.
So Mark, Edward just told us about imagination and innovation. You work a lot on the public policy space. So what would you say are the policies and domestic reforms that can support Africa in reaching the Sustainable Development Goals? And if you could touch on the innovations and the technology front as well.
Yeah, well, two broad sets. If we start saying that you need fundamentally that combination of public and private investment going in the key sectors that are most important. From our perspective, we tend to focus the Gates Foundation more on the sort of front cluster of SDGs 1 through 6, because that's that focuses on the world's very poorest, and while completely agreeing that they are all interconnected. And I think if you try to drive the investments into human capital, that tries to push you towards especially the health and education and social sectors. And there it's a question of both quantity. African governments on general spend around 15% of their GDP in taxes. It should be a little bit higher. Countries like South Africa are a little bit higher. But it's also an efficiency and effectiveness spend that you need to be able to have higher quality impact investments in, for example, in primary healthcare, because that's where healthcare prevention actually gets you a lot more bang for your buck, if you like, in terms of reducing child or maternal mortality than treating diseases once they've already happened. And that's why tools like vaccination or some of the provision of antiretrovirals or malaria bed nets are so powerful and have been such a strong contributing factor to how well Africa has done on balance on key indicators like reducing child mortality over the last 20 years. That said, if we are going to meet the goals of that decade of delivery, of the next 10 years to meet the SDGs, we simply cannot do that without new tools and new mechanisms in some key areas. That can include things like expanding digital financial inclusion. That's an area we work on heavily in the Gates Foundation and recently launched a new Africa Digital Financial Inclusion initiative in partnership with the African Development Bank and others, which is looking to expand, particularly focused on women, starting in West Africa. And we've already seen how those tools do have a disproportionate impact in terms of reducing poverty, providing access to resources for healthcare shocks, improving livelihoods overall, improving some of the agricultural development, climate resistance you're talking about. But we also need tools, for example, like malaria. They don't just have to be high tech. As resistance has grown among mosquitoes to the first generation of insecticide-covered bed nets, we've had to develop and are now rolling out as a community a new dual insecticide, which mosquitoes are not yet resistant to. It's a constant challenge and battle in all these sectors, and you have similar tools in the education space. So I think it's that combination of you need the policy space and the basic resources, the bulk of which still do come from the public sector at least laying the groundwork, but then can leverage and enable a sector that allows for private sector resources. And it requires that R&D, again, by both governments and the private sector, and where appropriate, philanthropies like us who can come in key areas and catalyze additional funds.
And within that, if I were to ask you, what do you think the public sector needs to do more to attract that private sector support and these partnerships that you mentioned?
Yes, so there are a number of different models to do. I mean, first and foremost is always having as transparent and open a sort of public sector financing system as possible, and a rigorous tax system. And it sounds very bread and butterish, but we know that's something that many countries, not just in Africa, have struggled to put in place and make sustainable. And so that kind of sort of fiscal public finance management is critical. But then on top of that, I think it really is about how you track the expenditure, the efficiency. In the end, the SDGs are public accountability commitments by governments to their own citizens. Every government in the world signed up to them in 2015. And so what you need is the benchmarks, the metrics, the data that actually tracks whether progress is being made indicator by indicator, that allows you to come and reset. Again, many of those are being put in place. There are many good examples across Africa right now of countries looking at frameworks and using SDG frameworks, but clearly that needs to be significantly accelerated.
André, I saw you shaking your head. Do you agree with what Mark has said? And from the experience you had in HIV and AIDS, what really stood out in terms of how the public sector partnered with you?
I think what I was really agreeing to is these interrelations of the different markers that we have. HIV has a devastating effect on families. Orphans have a devastating effect on social systems. HIV hits the majority of people who are in the prime of age, and majority males. So all this has an effect on society, which itself has an effect on agricultural practices, for instance, which itself has an effect on the biodiversity. So it really is quite important that we do develop these measurement systems, which will allow us to truly ascertain what the impact of these different factors are, how they aggregate to each other. And I completely agree as well that we don't need definitely the latest high-tech. I mean, some low-tech things can actually work. The fact that you prevent malaria, you use nets which are impregnated with anti-mosquito strikes me as being straightforward, to the point, and successful, rather than going to very complex molecules who very often have side effects which are not really needed.
So Eddie, as the youngest person on the panel, but also an African on the panel, what do you say Africa should do differently, especially given the work that you've been doing as an advocate for the UN on these matters?
Well, I think there's a profound recognition that young people need to play a meaningful role in terms of the decision-making process. That young people are have the innovative enterprises that they're setting up that are absolutely necessary for addressing the SDGs. And I think the important thing to underscore as well is that in the context of the private sector, there's opportunity not just to incorporate ESG into investing, otherwise known as impact investing, but I think business models themselves can be transformed and aligned to the SDGs in such a way that what is profitable is actually delivering on the SDGs. And I think that young people are setting up really interesting enterprises across the continent that really demonstrate that the SDGs are not just a blueprint for humanity, but could also be a really viable business plan in and of themselves. So I think that is really important. I think also, you know, the Deputy Secretary General mentioned this morning that leaving nobody behind, we need to give credence to that in a really meaningful way. And I think it's not just about amplifying the voices of those of us that are at greater risk of being left behind, but it's about how do we ensure that that the leadership comes from the most neglected and the most vulnerable segments of society. So I think for me, it's about moving beyond the kind of survival approach and recognizing sort of the inherent talent and human capital that young people, but also various marginalized communities represent when it comes to the SDGs.
All right. So this puts us in a good point now to come to you and see what kind of questions or comments you would have. There are microphones in the room. Please raise your hand so I can see you, and please be brief so we can take as many questions as possible.
Good. Can I maybe just add one thing, and building on what you said? Actually, what we at BCG found is that shareholder value or profitability correlates actually well and positively with total societal impact. And therefore, I think the business models that we need going forward, I think are being, whether it's in financial services and consumer goods, in healthcare, in the energy sector, we see companies that really focus also on other stakeholders and really have a positive total societal impact, are also having the higher margins. So I think there is no trade-off between doing well and doing good, and I think that is being increasingly recognized, and I think will also have a positive impact over the next 10 years.
No, this is an excellent point, and also links to the where will the money come from, because of the need to broaden the investor space to deal with the SDGs. So we have time for questions, and I'm looking around to see if there's anyone who would like to ask. But let me take from the audience, and then I'll ask you to respond to them. Any questions or comments? Anyone who's running an SDG business in the room or impacting on the SDGs? Yes, please. We have a gentleman in the back asking.
Hi, I'm Nimrod from Vital Capital Fund. We're an impact investing private equity fund that invests in sub-Saharan Africa. I think the SDGs are the compass to us all. What is a bit confusing to us in the last few years is the multiple ways and metrics to measure impact, and how do you see the relation between impact investment and SDGs?
All right. So I'll ask André that question. It is linked to the earlier question of shareholder value.
Yeah, I mean, there is so much to be said about this. First, when I was trying to interrupt earlier on, what I was trying to say is that for me, the fact that these SDGs are interrelated is in fact articulated around an important issue, which is to maintain the life supporting system on Earth. And this life supporting system depends heavily on natural capital and on the capacity at humanity to manage these resources in a sustainable manner. You cannot have a sustainable goal which does not produce an income, and that income cannot be only produced by artificial means. It also has to include a certain amount of nature. Now, to the subject of impact investment. Impact investment is an investment like any other one. You know, you don't have to sort of start saying that you're doing, you are a better investor because you do good by doing it. An investment that doesn't achieve its goals is not an investment that is successful. So the idea of saying because it is an impact investment, it should be assessed with different criteria, I find very difficult to understand.
Yeah.
One of my mentors in the past used to, when we were talking about conservation, always says you cannot be green if you are in the red.
Yeah.
And for me, that's absolutely clear. If the business model doesn't work, it will never have an impact. So let's stop calling it impact investment. There are inefficiency in the way we deal with the environment. Each way, be it social or natural, by the way, each of these inefficiencies can be corrected at a profit. And if it's not corrected at a profit, the solution is probably not sustainable. I don't know if that is the answer to your question or not.
Mark?
Yeah, so maybe to build on that, it's just, and you're personally speaking, I have a problem with the big umbrella terms like impact investing and blended finance, not because they're bad, they're good, but because they're so large and undifferentiated, it doesn't actually help you come to conclusions of what the right way to maximize the investments are. So I think they actually look a little different sector by sector and issue by issue. And when we look at it through the lens of, say, what the Gates Foundation does, we're constantly seeing, are there ways we can use our resources to catalyze investments, particularly private sector investments that will produce public goods, in our case, public goods that might be measurable by SDG targets, that without our intervention wouldn't have happened. So kind of example would be, a few years ago, we did a deal, not with Hoffmann, but with a couple of other big pharmaceutical companies who manufacture family planning implants, where in exchange for halving the price of their implants, which they didn't believe they could do because they didn't think there was a sustainable market, we gave a significant volume guarantee. We said, we've done the market research and we believe if you halve the price of your implants, you will still be able to make a profit if you sell this volume. And that we will guarantee if you fail to make that volume, we'll make up the difference, but we'd like you to go and sell those implants. 3 years later, both companies exceeded their targets. We didn't have to use our capital. We proved the market. That market now exists. Another kind of example in sanitation might be we've invested a lot of money in what we call the reinvented toilet, trying to create new sanitation prototypes that don't use piped sanitation because the pace of urbanization in the developing world means it's simply impossible to use traditional piped sewage infrastructure for large parts of the developing world and reach slums. So if you're going to have safely managed sanitation, you're going to need non-piped waterless models. So we've done the investment into these prototypes, which we now have several prototypes at work. We own the intellectual property because it's our development through partners. But we are now seeking commercial partners because we feel we have commercializable technologies where in exchange for subsidized versions that would work for the poorest, this will be a commercial technology which we think will be profit generating in a number of middle income countries, and we're engaged in a number of discussions with potential manufacturers. So for me, it's less about talking about the space as a whole, but looking sector by sector, issue by issue, topic by topic, and seeing are there ways you can bring together these different pools of finance in interesting ways that have measurable SDG impact as one of their outcomes.
Hans-Paul, Mark has just mentioned the innovations that they are using at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation to attract investment into this SDG space. When you look at the capital market side and the work that you've been doing at BCG, what incentives should public sector put in place to attract capital markets, and particularly domestic capital markets in Africa?
Well, I think the key issue, as I mentioned before, is really reliability and making sure that you know what you have in terms of laws and regulations, has a long life, so that you can really rely on your investments bringing certain returns. And I think one of the key elements very often is not about creating something new and innovative. Very often it's very mundane, but removing obstacles and bottlenecks. And I think the public sector could do much better in making sure that you have more people able and willing to invest, and rather than trying to say to specify everything to the last minute and to the last dot, and not getting the commitment. So I think clearly, and we discussed it also earlier this morning at a meeting with some of the presidents, and one of the presidents was emphasizing, a president from Uganda, removing the bottlenecks. And I think this is so crucial. And he talked about 10 bottlenecks, and he didn't get through all of them. But I think the removal of bottlenecks is so crucial to get incentives. And I think also emphasizing what André and Mark have said beforehand, it needs to be economically. Something that needs subsidization forever, really is sapping, the resource of a country. And if you have public sector companies which are losing money, year after year after year, it will not work. It will not strengthen the country, and it will certainly not help us to get to the SDGs. So I think the important thing is to make sure that things are very much, as you talked about your toilets, or you talked about the devise, family planning device. I think making sure that it works and it's economic. Yeah, and then I think the investment will come, and I think that is really crucial to understand. And there is no trade-off between good economics and really good progress. Yeah? Without economics, there will not be progress. Yeah? You can subsidize things for a while, but if it doesn't happen, it will collapse, and then we really regress.
So Eddie, I come back to you since you brought up this issue of new models.
Yeah.
And imaginative thinking. So when you look around, which are the most exciting examples that you can give, maybe one or two, that are moving in that direction of new ideas and imaginative ideas? We have the toilet one, which is very exciting, and seeing Bill Gates talk about it is quite amazing. But are there any others that you can point to?
Sure. So I guess against the backdrop of the fourth industrial revolution, I'm seeing examples of sort of big multinational companies, particularly in the resource sector, that are really looking at developing interesting product offerings around. Yesterday I had a fascinating conversation with a CEO of a large resource company, and he was talking about new batteries that they are developing that are more not just energy efficient, but I think really speak to addressing SDG 13 around the climate crisis in a really meaningful way. So I think it's really about, again, it comes back to what was said by my fellow panelists around thinking about how we leverage sort of the existing economic models in a really strong way to be able to have product offerings that link up to the SDGs. So I think that's sort of my take. But again, I think it comes back to multi-stakeholder approaches and really having partnerships, because I don't think that one business or one enterprise can do it alone. I think it really means listening quite attentively to what's being said by civil society, to what's being said by multilateral institutions as well.
All right. So we have time for more questions. And is there, yes, please, we have a question right here.
Yes, it's Ann Cabot-Alitzhauser from the Alexander Forbes Research Institute. And I don't think we should be quite so glib about the concept that impact investing is just what we should all be doing. I think there's a very distinctive difference in what people who are advocating impact investing are suggesting. And they're suggesting that we've really got to start measuring different things than what typically the public markets measure in terms of what value a business decision makes. And I'll use an example, like 3D printing. Now, 3D printing is a fantastic innovation. And 3D printing can do something to the effect that it can create incredibly cost-effective, hearing aids are 99% all 3D printing nowadays. And that brings the cost of hearing aids down to nothing. So there's a multiplier effect there. But 3D printing can also put out SMMEs out of business because it gets rid of elements of the value chain that are job creating, or it can contribute to the creation of SMMEs, depending on where the 3D printing is used in the production process. So what I think impact investing is trying to do is saying, let's understand what the impact of that every dollar that you put on the table has, not just on the economic value you get back from that company, but the economic value that that company has in terms of how it contributes either to job creation or to the reduction in costs. And those are really, really difficult things to start measuring. But my goodness, we're working with big data, we're working with all sorts of measurement tools now. If we start honing in on those kinds of criteria, I think that's going to be much, much more powerful than the metrics that we're currently using to measure the value of a publicly listed company.
All right. So this puts a very interesting question to now pose it to all the panelists, but to also use it to frame your closing statement. A number of ideas have come on the table. We need new imaginative ways to go forward. We need different ways of measuring, different methods of financing and attracting others into the space, and a different relation between the public and the private sector. So I'll start in the reverse order first with André. If you would respond to this issue and also use the opportunity to make your closing remarks.
Okay, well, thank you very much. This idea of short-term profit maximization, the way business is being measured, the way success is being measured, is an absolute disaster. It is what has destroyed the planet socially and environmentally. So we need to address that. And if we have to give it as a name, impact investing, then let's call it impact investing. Businesses will need to invent ways of creating long-term value, and the Sustainable Development Goals will help them in doing that because it gives them a scorecard which allows them to compare performance. Sadly, it does not resolve the issue of remuneration of the capital invested on a systemic basis. So we need to be able to measure performance of companies in a different way. At the moment, we only measure profitability. We should be looking at impact. We should be looking at the way in which these companies influence the planet. I think today, a company which decides to do no harm is already a little bit delayed in the reaction that it has towards the environment. Now, our investments today need to be regenerative. We need to repair what has been damaged. And this is very much in that spirit that this program I described before, this diagnosis program, was conceived. This is not maximization of our profit. It's a partnership which allows us to help the World Health Organization to reach its target at the profit which is sufficient to keep the thing going. Sustainability includes profitability. Without that, there is no possibility. So in that background, the reason I carry this badge and the reason I tour as many people as I can to tell them about the goals is because I believe that it is a moment in history where we need to have businesses stepping up to the real challenge that we're facing. And businesses as a force for good can be a solution in our economies in the developed part of the world, but it is also a fantastic opportunity for developing countries and in particular for the African continent, because you have here this enormous natural capital which needs to be used to create a new way of creating value. And there are numbers of ideas circulating. They are often facilitated and made possible by huge philanthropy, and your organization comes to mind. But we need business to pick that up and to develop local models which will allow to create a sustainable economy. Mm-hmm. So that would be my remark.
All right, thank you. Mark?
Well, even though as an organization, the Gates Foundation values innovation as one of our most fundamental aspirations and where we put a huge amount of our resources, my first part of the answer is actually to consolidate and double down what we know already. That we're coming out of 2 decades of significant progress in key sectors, like the health area, where child mortality, for example, has more than halved over that period. And that's been through things like just rolling out vaccinations and making vaccinations now, routine vaccinations across 80% of the world's children. Now that still means 1 in 5 children are not getting vaccinated. We need to actually change that, and working with organizations like Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance, make sure in the next decade that does change. But so one element is just that, and that's true in the malaria space, like the bed nets example I talked about, or in the HIV space of prevention and diagnostics, or in the agriculture space. There are lots of existing routes to improve productivity for smallholder farmers that will deal with climate resistance. But at the same time, we know that those existing tools will not quite be enough to meet the SDGs. So we do need new types of innovative crops that are going to be more drought or flood resistant, because we know that climate change is putting even greater challenges on that. So we put the research in. We are hopeful that this will be a decade in which we see potentially vaccines for some of the bigger killer diseases like HIV, malaria, or TB, in addition to our treatments. We do think that the digital tools we're having around financial inclusion right now are actually already expanding in a way that has more than significant potential to. It's actually transforming lives across this continent. So for us, it's very much a both and, but we remain, and a phrase that Bill and Melinda Gates use frequently, impatient optimists about what we can do in the next 10 years.
All right, thank you. Hans-Paul?
Well, I would like to emphasize the point of a real partnership of private enterprise and public entities. And I think the finger pointing that we see very often, I think, is not productive. And I think it's very important, to see that, we have made enormous progress, and private companies are also very interested in longevity, in sustainability, in all aspects, because corporate longevity is based on delivering value for customers, in countries and around the world. And so this idea about, short-term profit maximization at the, expense of society, I think, yes, it happens occasionally, but the large majority of companies really want to engage and clearly see their value added as, really creating a value for a need that is there in societies around the world. And otherwise, there is no license to operate, and otherwise, there's also no corporate longevity. And I think we need to overcome this suspicion from both sides, that the other side is underperforming, badly meaning, and therefore cannot contribute to the SDGs. And I think only together we can achieve that. We should not forget, especially here in South Africa, we need to create jobs. All these. Young people, there is only a demographic dividend if these people have a chance to forge their own future and own destiny, and jobs are not coming from heaven, they're coming not out of, whatever in the government sector cannot produce it alone. We need private enterprise, we need entrepreneurs, business people who really make it work.
Okay, thank you. Eddie?
Well, I think it was Bill Gates who said that we overestimate what can be achieved in a year, and we underestimate what can be achieved in a decade. So as we march towards the decade of delivery for the Sustainable Development Goals, I think that we have an opportunity to raise the level of ambition and push for accelerated action. And for that to happen, I will insist that we need to decompartmentalize our thinking and ensure that we're able to look at the bigger picture, the bigger identity, and connect the SDGs in such a way that we're able to respond to the fact that as people, we embody a multiplicity of identities and experiences simultaneously. And so the challenge for all of us, for policymakers and for business leaders, is to figure out how do we become more deliberate and more intersectional in our methodologies.
All right. So we are out of time, and I'll close by giving a few remarks. I didn't mention up front where I'm from. I'm from the Trade and Development Bank, where we do finance infrastructure, but also trade and manufacturing and industrial work as well. And what I see from there, which has come out really from this panel, is that yes, Africa has made tremendous achievements and it's also lagging behind, and we need $1 trillion to get there. So where is the money going to come from? You have the domestic pension funds that are more and more contributing to the SDGs. You have the domestic capital markets, Mauritius exchange, joining up with the Johannesburg exchange, with the Nairobi exchange, and bringing more capital to the table. And then you have high net worth individuals like Patrice Motsepe, Aliko Dangote, Mo Ibrahim, and others who have also come forward to help solve a number of challenges, learning from Bill Gates and Warren Buffett and others who have done the same in their space. So there are 3 key things that remain to be done. I think the measurement issue is a key one, how to rethink how we measure, how we track, so we can support new ideas and new business models. The fact that public and private partnerships are critical, including civil society, so that when you talk about inclusion, we look at it in a broader way, and I think this was very strongly mentioned, the youth and other excluded groups. And then finally, the very critical importance of incentives that would bring in not only the private sector to do more in the sustainable development space, but also for the public sector to open up the opportunity for private solutions to come to the fore. So we have a saying in Africa that goes like this: if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. So I think all the innovators in the room should go fast so we can get those new ideas. But in order to take them to scale, we need to go together, and that means going far, so that by 2030, we can get to the targets that Africa has committed for itself. So thank you very much for your attention. We've run out of time, and look forward to seeing you in other sessions. Thank you very much. Please join me in thanking the panel. Thank you.